I never imagined that an innocent dinner invitation would expose the biggest betrayal of my best friend's life. It was a typical Friday evening when my best friend Tom invited me over for dinner. Tom and I had been close since college, sharing everything from late-night study sessions to the ups and downs of life. His wife, Jessica, had been part of our circle for nearly as long. They were the kind of couple that seemed to have it all, deeply in love, with a relationship that many envied. So, when Tom asked me to join them for dinner, I didn't think twice. It was just another chance to catch up with old friends. As I walked up to their front door, I couldn't help but notice how perfect their home looked. The lawn was impeccably manicured, the porch light cast a warm glow, and everything seemed in its place, just like their lives. Jessica greeted me with her usual bright smile, ushering me into the living room where Tom was already pouring drinks. We settled into comfortable conversation, reminiscing about old times and laughing over shared memories. However, as the evening progressed, I started to notice something that didn't quite fit with the picture of perfection they always projected. Jessica seemed distracted. Her phone, which she usually kept tucked away during social gatherings, was constantly buzzing. She glanced at it more than once, her face growing increasingly tense with each notification. Tom didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he was simply choosing to ignore it, but I could tell something was off. Dinner was served in their elegantly decorated dining room, and the conversation continued, though Jessica's distraction was becoming more apparent. At one point, she excused herself to take a call, leaving Tom and me alone at the table. I tried to keep the mood light, but the tension in the room was palpable. Tom seemed oblivious to his wife's behavior, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Jessica returned a few minutes later, her expression more guarded than before. She tried to jump back into the conversation, but her usual warmth was missing. Tom, ever the gracious host, didn't seem to notice the shift, but I could see that Jessica was struggling to maintain her composure. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of polite conversation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. When the evening finally came to an end, Jessica offered to walk me out to my car. As soon as we were out of Tom's earshot, she turned to me, her face pale and anxious. "Please," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't say anything to Tom about tonight. There's something I need to deal with, but I don't want him to find out like this." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Jessica, what's going on?" I asked, my voice low and cautious. She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "There's someone else," she finally admitted, her voice trembling. "I've been seeing someone else, and I don't know how to stop. I never meant for it to go this far, but now I'm in too deep, and I don't know what to do." I felt the ground drop out from under me. Tom was one of my closest friends, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jessica, the woman he adored, the woman he had built a life with, was cheating on him. For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the implications of her confession. Tom had no idea what was happening behind his back, and now I was caught in the middle of a nightmare. "Jessica," I finally managed to say, my voice strained, "you need to tell him. You can't keep this a secret. Tom deserves to know the truth." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I just can't. It would destroy him, and I don't want to hurt him like that." "You're already hurting him by keeping this from him," I insisted, my frustration growing. "If you love him, you owe it to him to be honest. You can't just keep pretending like everything is fine." Jessica looked down, her hands trembling. "I know you're right," she whispered, "but I'm scared. I don't know how to tell him, and I'm afraid of what will happen if I do." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "This can't go on, Jessica. It's not fair to Tom, and it's not fair to you either. If you don't tell him, I might have to." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, just give me some time," she pleaded. "I promise I'll talk to him. Just please don't say anything yet." Reluctantly, I nodded. "Okay," I said, though I wasn't convinced she would follow through. But don't wait too long. The longer you keep this from him, the worse it's going to be. As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the situation I had just been thrust into. I was angry. Angry at Jessica for betraying Tom, angry at myself for being in the middle of it, and angry at the universe for putting me in such a terrible position. I knew that I couldn't just sit back and do nothing, but I also didn't want to be the one to destroy my friend's life. The whole situation felt like a no-win scenario, and I was trapped in the middle of it. The next few days were torturous. I tried to go about my life as usual, but the knowledge of Jessica's infidelity weighed heavily on me. I avoided Tom, not because I didn't want to see him, but because I couldn't bear to look him in the eye, knowing what I knew. Every time my phone rang, I feared it would be Jessica, telling me she hadn't been able to tell him yet. And every time it wasn't her, my anxiety grew. Finally, after a week of sleepless nights and constant anxiety, I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. Tom deserved to know the truth, and if Jessica wasn't going to tell him, then I would. I called Tom and asked if we could meet up for a drink, something we often did when one of us needed to talk. He didn't suspect anything out of the ordinary and agreed to meet me at our usual bar. When I arrived, Tom was already there, sitting at our usual table with a beer in hand. He greeted me with a smile, but I could see that something was bothering him. As I sat down, I noticed that he looked more tired than usual, like he hadn't been sleeping well. I wondered if he had already suspected something was wrong, or if this was just the stress of life catching up with him. "Tom," I began, my voice heavy with the weight of what I was about to say. "There's something I need to tell you. It's not easy, and it's gonna hurt, but you deserve to know." Tom looked at me with concern, clearly sensing the seriousness of the situation. "What is it? What's going on?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the inevitable fallout. "It's about Jessica," I said slowly, "and another man." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and I saw the color drain from Tom's face as he processed what I had just said. His initial reaction was disbelief, and he demanded to know if I was certain, if there was any chance I was mistaken. But as I relayed what Jessica had confided in me, the truth began to sink in. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal, and it broke my heart to see my friend in so much pain. For a few moments, Tom just sat there, staring at his drink in silence. I could tell he was trying to process everything, to make sense of what he had just heard. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. "She said she was scared, that she didn't want to hurt you. But I told her that she needed to be honest with you. I gave her time to tell you herself, but I couldn't keep it from you any longer." Tom nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing with a million thoughts. "I appreciate you telling me," he said quietly. "I know it couldn't have been easy for you." "It wasn't," I agreed. "But you deserve to know the truth. You deserve better than to be kept in the dark." The next few weeks were a blur of pain and confusion. Tom confronted Jessica, and the truth came out in a torrent of tears and anger. Their marriage, once so solid, was now hanging by a thread. I tried to be there for Tom as much as I could, but I knew that nothing I said or did could make up for the betrayal he had experienced. Tom and Jessica continued to live under the same roof, but the atmosphere in their home was tense and strained. They barely spoke to each other, and when they did, it was only out of necessity. The once warm and loving relationship they had shared was now filled with bitterness and resentment. Tom was devastated, and I could see that he was struggling to keep it together. One evening, Tom called me, his voice sounding distant and weary. He wanted to talk, to figure out what to do next. We met at our usual spot, a quiet bar on the outskirts of town. The place was nearly empty, with dim lighting and soft music creating a somber ambiance that matched Tom's mood. When I arrived, Tom was already there, staring into his drink as if it held the answers to the turmoil in his heart. I could see the weight of the situation etched on his face. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by a sense of exhaustion and defeat. I sat down across from him, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things that had been left unsaid. "I don't know what to do," Tom finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, almost as if he was afraid to speak too loudly, fearing the reality of his situation. Part of me wants to forgive her, to move past this and try to rebuild what we had, but another part of me feels like I'll never be able to trust her again. I listened, feeling the depth of his pain. Trust is hard to rebuild, especially after something like this, I said carefully. But it's not impossible. It depends on whether both of you are willing to put in the work. The question is, do you think it's worth it? Tom looked down at his drink, as if the answer might be found at the bottom of the glass. "I don't know," he admitted. "I love her, but every time I look at her, all I can think about is her with someone else. It tears me apart inside." "I can only imagine how hard this is for you," I said softly. "But you need to decide what's best for you. Do you think you can ever truly forgive her? Or will this always be between you two, poisoning your relationship?" Tom sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "That's the thing. I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever be able to get past this, but the thought of losing her, it scares me." We sat in silence for a while, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I wished I could offer him some kind of guidance, but the truth was, I didn't have the answers. Relationships are complicated, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to betrayal. As the days turned into weeks, Tom and Jessica tried to navigate the fragile terrain of their relationship. They went to couples therapy, trying to work through the pain and rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But it was clear that things were different now. The easy laughter and affection that once defined their marriage had been replaced by a tense, uneasy truce. Jessica was remorseful, doing everything she could to prove to Tom that she was committed to making things right. She cut off all contact with the other man, changed her phone number, and even quit her job to remove herself from any lingering temptations. But despite her efforts, the wound she had inflicted on their marriage was deep, and it wasn't healing as quickly as either of them had hoped. Tom, for his part, was torn between his love for Jessica and the pain of her betrayal. He wanted to forgive her, to move past what had happened and rebuild their life together. But every time he looked at her, he couldn't help but wonder if she was thinking about the other man. The trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship was gone, and in its place was a gnawing sense of doubt and insecurity. One evening, a few months after I had first told Tom about Jessica's infidelity, he called me again. His voice was tired, but there was a new determination in it that I hadn't heard before. "I've made a decision," he said. "Jessica and I are going to separate. We've tried to make it work, but it's just not happening. The trust is gone, and without it, there's no point in continuing." I felt a pang of sadness at his words, but I also understood. "I'm sorry it came to this," I said, "but I think you're making the right choice. Sometimes, no matter how much you want things to work out, they just can't." "Yeah," Tom agreed, his voice heavy. "It hurts, but I know it's the best thing for both of us. We can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not. It's better to end things now, before we do any more damage to each other." The next few weeks were difficult for Tom as he and Jessica navigated the logistics of their separation. They sold their house, divided their belongings, and tried to figure out how to move on from the life they had built together. It was a painful process, but in some ways, it was also a relief. The tension that had been hanging over them for months was finally starting to lift, and they both began to find a sense of closure. Tom moved into a small apartment across town, and for the first time in years, he was living on his own. It was an adjustment, and there were days when the loneliness hit him hard. But as time went on, he started to rediscover parts of himself that he had lost during his marriage. He took up old hobbies, reconnected with friends he hadn't seen in years, and slowly began to rebuild his life.
Jessica, too, was struggling to find her footing. She regretted what she had done, and there were days when she wished she could turn back the clock and make different choices. But she knew that what was done, and all she could do now was learn from her mistakes and try to move forward. A few months after their separation, Tom and I met up for another drink. This time, the atmosphere was lighter, the weight of the past few months no longer pressing down on us. "How are you holding up?" I asked as we sat down at our usual table. Tom took a sip of his beer and shrugged. "I'm getting there," he said. "It's been hard, but I'm starting to feel like myself again. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have control over my life." "That's good to hear," I said, genuinely relieved. "You've been through a lot, but you're coming out the other side strong." "Yeah," Tom agreed. "I never thought I'd be in this situation, but I guess life has a way of throwing curveballs at you when you least expect it." We talked for a while longer, catching up on life and reminiscing about old times. As we sat there, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for my friend. He had been through hell, but he had come out the other side with his head held high. He was rebuilding his life on his own terms, and I knew that he would be okay. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that ultimately set us free. Tom and Jessica's marriage had ended, but in doing so, they had both been given a chance to start over, to find happiness in their own ways. It wasn't the ending any of us had wanted, but it was the one that allowed them both to move forward. As for me, I had learned a lot from being caught in the middle of their situation. I had seen firsthand the damage that secrets and lies can do to a relationship, and I knew that honesty, no matter how painful, was always the best policy. It was a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life. In the end, life goes on. Tom and Jessica moved on, each finding their own paths. And while their story didn't have a fairy tale ending, it was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a way forward.
I stumbled upon a secret that turned my perception of my sister-in-law upside down, and I had to decide whether to expose the truth or keep it buried. I stumbled upon a secret that turned my perception of my sister-in-law upside down, and I had to decide whether to expose the truth or keep it buried. It all started with a simple favor. My brother Mike had asked me to house sit while he and his wife, Emily, went on a week-long vacation to celebrate their 10th anniversary. It wasn't the first time I'd done this for them, so I didn't think much of it. They had a cozy home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and I always enjoyed the peaceful solitude their house provided. Mike and Emily had been married for a decade, and from the outside, their relationship seemed solid. They were the type of couple everyone admired. Affectionate, supportive, and always on the same page. I had no reason to believe that there was anything but love between them, so when I agreed to house sit, I expected a quiet week of relaxing in front of their big screen TV and enjoying the comforts of their home. The first few days were uneventful. I took care of their dog, watered the plants, and made myself comfortable in their guest room. The house was as tidy as ever, and everything was exactly as I remembered it. It wasn't until the third day that I noticed something odd. It was a rainy afternoon, and I had decided to spend the day inside, catching up on some reading. As I was searching for a book in the living room, I stumbled across a small, unmarked box tucked away on a high shelf. It looked out of place, as if someone had hidden it there in a hurry. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it down to take a closer look. Opening the box, I was met with a collection of items that didn't seem to belong to Mike or Emily. There were a few pieces of jewelry, none of which I had ever seen Emily wear, along with a handful of photographs. The photos were what caught my attention the most. They were pictures of Emily, but not with Mike. In every photo, she was with another man, smiling, holding hands, even kissing. The man wasn't someone I recognized, but it was clear from the images that they were more than just friends. My heart started to race as I processed what I was seeing. Emily was having an affair. There was no other explanation. I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me, followed quickly by anger. How could she do this to Mike? He adored her, had built his life around her, and now I was holding proof that she had betrayed him. I didn't know what to do. part of me wanted to confront Emily the moment she returned, to demand an explanation and make her face the consequences of her actions. But another part of me hesitated. Mike was my brother, and I didn't want to be the one to shatter his world. What if I was wrong? What if there was some innocent explanation for the photos, despite how damning they looked? For the rest of the week, I couldn't stop thinking about the box and its contents. Every time I saw a text from Mike or heard Emily's voice on the phone when they checked in, I felt a pang of guilt. I was holding onto a secret that could destroy their marriage, and I had no idea what to do with it. When Mike and Emily returned from their vacation, they seemed as happy as ever. They thanked me for taking care of the house, and Mike even joked about how nice it was to have a break from the daily grind. Emily smiled, her expression warm and genuine, and I couldn't reconcile the woman in front of me with the one in the photos. I tried to act normal, but I could feel the tension building inside me. Every time I looked at Emily, I saw the images from the box. Every time Mike talked about how much he loved her, I felt like I was going to burst. I needed to know the truth, and I needed to decide what to do with it. A few days later, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked Emily if she wanted to grab lunch, just the two of us. She seemed a little surprised but agreed, and we met at a small cafe in town. As we sat down, I could tell she wasn't suspicious. Why would she be? To her, this was just a casual lunch between family. But as we talked, I could barely focus on the conversation. All I could think about was the box and the photos. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Emily," I said, my voice steady but firm, "I found something at the house while you were gone. Something that concerns Mike." She looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. "What do you mean? What did you find?" I took a deep breath, preparing myself for what I was about to say. "I found a box hidden in the living room with photos of you and another man." Her face turned pale, and I could see the panic in her eyes. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Please, let me explain," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like." "Then what is it?" I demanded, struggling to keep my emotions in check. "Because it looks pretty damning from where I'm standing." Emily looked down, her hands trembling as she tried to gather her thoughts. "It was a mistake," she finally said. "I met him during a really rough time in our marriage, and things just happened. But it's over now. I ended it months ago." "Does Mike know?" I asked, my heart pounding. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, he doesn't know, and I don't want him to. It would destroy him. Please, you can't tell him. I made a mistake, but I love Mike, and I'm committed to making our marriage work." I stared at her, torn between my loyalty to my brother and the knowledge that I was now part of a secret that could devastate him. "Emily, how can I not tell him? He deserves to know the truth." "I know he does," she said, her voice breaking. "But I'm begging you, please don't. We've been working through our issues, and things have been getting better. I don't want to lose him." I sat there, grappling with the weight of the decision in front of me. If I told Mike, I would be doing the right thing by being honest with him, but in doing so, I might also be destroying his happiness, and possibly the future of his marriage. In the end, I agreed to keep the secret, for now. But I made it clear to Emily that if she didn't tell Mike soon, I would. She needed to be honest with him, even if it meant risking everything. The days that followed were agonizing. I avoided Mike as much as possible, fearing that I would slip up and say something that would reveal what I knew. Emily assured me that she was going to tell him, but as time passed, I began to doubt whether she ever would. Eventually, the guilt became too much. I couldn't keep lying to my brother, and I couldn't stand the thought of him being in the dark while everyone else knew the truth. One evening, when I knew Mike would be home alone, I went over to his house. He was surprised to see me, but welcomed me in, asking if everything was okay. I could tell he sensed something was off, and I knew there was no turning back now. "Mike," I began, my voice shaking, There's something I need to tell you, something that you need to know." As I explained everything, the photos, my conversation with Emily, and the secret I had been keeping, Mike's face went from confusion to disbelief, and then to devastation. He didn't say a word as I spoke, just listened in stunned silence. When I finished, there was a long, painful silence between us. "I'm so sorry, Mike," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt you, but you deserve to know the truth." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and anger. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't she trust me enough to be honest?" "I don't know," I admitted, feeling a deep sense of guilt for my role in all of this. "But I couldn't keep this from you any longer. You needed to know." Mike didn't say much after that. He thanked me for telling him, but I could see that he was struggling to process everything. I left him alone, knowing that he needed time to come to terms with what he had just learned. In the weeks that followed, Mike and Emily's marriage hung by a thread. They had long, difficult conversations, and both of them were forced to confront the reality of their situation. Mike was devastated, but he also loved Emily, and he wasn't ready to give up on their marriage without a fight. Emily, for her part, was filled with regret and guilt. She knew that she had made a terrible mistake, and she was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. They started going to therapy, both individually and as a couple, and slowly began the difficult process of rebuilding their relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were times when it seemed like they wouldn't make it, but over time, they began to find a new sense of trust and understanding. The road to recovery was long and painful, but they were committed to walking it together. There were setbacks along the way, moments of doubt, anger, and sadness that threatened to tear them apart, but they held on to the love that had brought them together in the first place. For months, their lives were consumed by the struggle to heal and move forward. Therapy sessions were intense, often bringing up old wounds that needed to be addressed before they could truly move on. They had to learn how to communicate in ways they never had before, to be open and vulnerable with each other in ways that were both terrifying and necessary. Emily was determined to prove to Mike that he could trust her again. She was patient, understanding that trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. She was transparent about her actions and whereabouts, and she made a point of showing Mike how much she valued their marriage. Slowly, Mike began to see the effort she was making, and though the pain of her betrayal lingered, he started to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through this. Their friends and family noticed the change in them. Some were supportive, offering words of encouragement and admiration for their resilience. Others were skeptical, wondering if it was possible to truly move past such a deep betrayal. But Mike and Emily knew that the only opinions that mattered were their own. They were the ones living this reality, and they were the ones who had to decide if their marriage was worth saving. As time went on, the rawness of the wound began to fade. They started to rediscover the things that had brought them together in the first place. The shared laughter, the comfort of each other's presence, the sense of partnership that had once been the cornerstone of their relationship. They began to build new memories, ones that were untainted by the past, and slowly, the cracks in their marriage began to mend. But it wasn't just about moving past the affair. They had to address the underlying issues that had led to the affair in the first place. The communication breakdowns, the unspoken resentments, the unmet needs that had festered over time. They worked hard to ensure that their relationship was stronger and more resilient than it had ever been before. It took over a year, but eventually, Mike and Emily reached a place where they felt secure in their marriage again. The affair was no longer the defining feature of their relationship, but rather a painful chapter that they had overcome together. They emerged from the experience with a deeper understanding of each other and with a renewed commitment to making their marriage work. As for me, I remained close with both Mike and Emily throughout the process. There were times when I questioned whether I had done the right thing by revealing the affair, but in the end, I knew that honesty had been the only option. It wasn't easy being the one to deliver such devastating news, but I believed that it had been necessary for Mike to know the truth. In the years that followed, Mike and Emily's marriage continued to grow stronger. They welcomed their first child, a baby girl, and the joy of parenthood brought them even closer together. They were far from perfect, but they had learned how to weather the storms that life threw their way. Looking back, I realized that their journey had taught me a lot about the complexities of love, forgiveness, and trust. It wasn't always easy to navigate the murky waters of relationships, but I had seen firsthand that with enough dedication and effort, it was possible to come out the other side stronger than before. Mike and Emily's story wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real, and it was theirs. And in the end, that was what mattered most.